Expectations versus Reality webinar. Before we begin, I'm just going to review a few housekeeping items so that you're all aware. First of all, everyone will remain on mute for the duration of the call. In addition, we're going to encourage you to ask questions by submitting them via the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. You can submit them at any time, and we'll be able to follow up with any of you who have submitted questions after the webinar directly. So that functionality will be open for the duration of our broadcast. We will also be sharing a recording of today's session following the webinar. But for now, I would like to turn it over to Ruud Van Hilton, who is our Senior Vice President of Compliance here at Tungsten, to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Emma. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Almost by virtue of exception, you can see Sam and I now, I think, live. If you have access to a screen, don't worry, we will switch this off at some point. But just to show you that we are real life people, and like so many other people, like so many of you probably, working from home today. So I'm here with Sam Purchase, who is our solution architect. And we're here to talk about, I would say a rather cryptical title, expectations versus reality, and what to expect when you really weren't expecting this. Our topic for today is, unfortunately, I would almost say, the COVID-19 virus and the global pandemic we're all going through at the moment, and which really leaves nobody unaffected, I would say. The topic for today is what is the impact of the coronavirus on accounts receivable and accounts payable departments? What is happening out there? And if you talk about the expected, up until about 5, 6, 7 weeks ago, pretty much every economy in the world was booming. Things were going swimmingly, and everybody was probably looking at things to do for the summer holidays or the May holidays even over Easter. And I believe our visions, our expectations have been completely reset, as they have also been for businesses. So we're here today to briefly talk to you about what we're seeing out there. Why do we have an opinion about this? As Tungsten Network, we are, as many of you will know, an electronic invoicing network. We have an opinion about this, and we talk about this because we see almost firsthand what the COVID virus does to businesses, what they're currently struggling with, and how potentially there might be some solutions, but also how this is probably going to move forward, or what we think is going to happen moving forward. And the first thing we want to talk to you about, as I said earlier, about what is happening out there in the market, what are businesses undergoing at the moment. And I'll now do you the pleasure to switch off my camera so we can actually focus on the topic at hand. So what we're seeing out there at the moment is under pressure of global lockdowns, and where millions of people are currently being forced to work from home, leaving their familiar workplaces. And with that workplace, they actually also leave their process, maybe their equipment, their colleagues, of course, the interaction with their colleagues. We become almost like solitary but very connected islands that are attempting to do what we were doing before, but now in a very, very different way. And I don't think it is a secret to many of you that quite a number of companies out there are currently fighting for their survival, which is an awful place to be in. And one of the things that we're seeing, especially in AP and AR, which is our, I would say, our first focus as a business, is that the processes that seem to be working before no longer work today. And there's multiple reasons for that. And I'm going to ask Sam a few questions about this in a few seconds. But if I may, well, what we see happening is that the most commonly used process between businesses are typically, the things that matter most of them are sales orders and sales invoices, purchase invoices. The companies really want to, of course, help each other, produce for each other, render each other services, and in return for that, they seek to get paid. And very often that is still done on paper, which seems to be the most common denominator at the moment. It's the thing that every business does, is to send each other invoices, usually actually in large numbers still on paper. And while that seems to be the most acceptable way of doing invoices between businesses, It is just that, exactly that process that is currently under tremendous pressure. And I wanted to hear from Sam. Sam, what are you seeing out there when it comes to problems that organizations are currently running into when it comes to trying to invoice each other using the standard, almost the most prolific way of doing that today, which is a paper invoice?
Yeah, and I think so, you know, as part of this, I think there's been sort of a fundamental shock that as businesses have been running around, you know, businesses are sending people home. That's just a fact in terms of that. And then, you know, paper processes are generally based on paper or documents arriving in some form of a central location and being run through a process. So very much what we're seeing is, even if people have outsourced stuff, you know, paper processes where pieces of paper arrive or pieces of paper get sent out, there's physically not the staff, there's physically not the people being available there to actually manage that process. So that fundamentally sort of has just completely changed the way businesses can actually process those documents. And what we're seeing is, and it kind of, you know, we talked about it being a fight for survival. It currently is brutal. And it is people really having to come up with as many ways as possible. With peer stories of, you know, scanners and desktop PCs being sent home with people buying screens, etc., trying to run even things of how do you run from an AB department, how do you run a phone sent line? You know, you generally have a centralized phone line into a department. How are you going to run that from home? So, you know, there's been a massive rush of people trying to work that out as a process. And I think the point you made of paper was, we kind of see paper as the lowest common denominator. And I think one of the things we've seen is that lowest common denominator has been removed. So actually what we find is a lot of businesses now are trying to work out what is that option, what is that thing that you can actually be doing now that option is no longer viable.
Thank you, Sam. And what we're also seeing, and more on the revenue side of businesses, is their attempt, very logically, to obviously do business in a different way. And we see quite a number of businesses move to what I would call e-commerce, moving their business more to online. To what extent is that sustainable if you can't actually use paper invoices?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously if you're moving to sort of online business models and that, a lot of that is tied up to, you know, any kind of drop shipment type processes that you're doing out there. You know, you need to have that invoice, or that invoice document becomes a key part of that process. So yeah, you know, and a lot of the things, if we think, it's kind of a lot of the sort of trends or things we might have been talking about for years of kind of being compressed into a really quick time period. So lots of companies would talk about digitization, you know, they want their front end, they want to do e-commerce, and really, you know, back ends quite often don't catch up. And now what we're seeing is the back end, you know, the front end is rapidly moving to an e-world, and the back end's got to move just as quick, because that safety net, really, that piece of paper safety net has been pulled out from underneath companies. So we've no longer got that there.
It's an interesting comment you make there, is that actually, so what we were all foreseeing through the future is that digitization, digital government, because, you know, we'll get to speak about the government in a second, but that has now been under tremendous pressure of, I would say, global disaster, has now been compressed into a very short time frame, which is resetting, again, the expectations that we all have. And at the same time, just speaking about governments, of course, many governments are currently stepping in with immense support programs to keep businesses afloat, to avoid mass unemployment. We'll talk a bit later about what that really means in terms of, you know, future taxation, and, you know, and how this is going to look in the near future with regards to invoicing. If you were to think about, there's always the question we ask: what happens if you don't do anything? And that really doesn't seem to be an option at the moment. What happens if you do nothing is apparently one of those things that you can't consider at the moment. So But at the same time, you could argue that every company has a business continuity plan. Right? Every company has a business resumption or a disaster recovery plan. How do you not believe that those should be sort of like giving people relief at this moment in time, or is that simply, is it too big for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we've been thinking about business continuity plans, and actually we're actually seeing a lot of these things kick off in, they're actually working and they're being in action. But I think we're finding that they probably never really envisioned, and I don't think any of us could say, oh, well, we envisioned something like this happening. And, they're just not designed for lockdown or going anything like this. And I think, one of the important, been trying to think about, if you don't do anything, I think fundamentally it is going to be absolutely horrendous for a business not doing anything. I think we're kind of almost beyond that point that people are just doing what they can do to survive, going back to that, that horrible, brutal reality that we're in. And I think, we've got business continuity plans, and yes, they are working some degree, but I think we've moved onto a phase beyond that. And, trying to think about what things are going to be like, or, traditional business environments. So I was just trying to imagine what a risk register would look like, the amount of risks and, the impacts these things are having on cash flow of businesses are just huge. So it's just the whole concept that, after this, if you manage to survive by not doing anything either, I still can't see that, business continuity plans, they're designed for us to go back to normal. And I'm just really struggling to see that that would be actually viable, in effect, just due to the huge nature and the scale of what's actually going on.
That's an interesting comment you make there. A business continuity plan, as you say, is there to secure business continuity and to give customer suppliers the comfort that things will return to normal after you've dealt with whatever disaster or business disruption you've been in. But this is not about not having access to Wi-Fi or your building or an outage. This is obviously much bigger. You could argue that Wi-Fi pretty much works as normal, and you still have access to the building, but you've had to send everybody home, and I don't think anybody would have ever foreseen that in these situations.
No.
You'd literally be taking computers out of the office and putting them in people's homes in order that they can continue to work. Where, of course, I would say the most basic infrastructure may sometimes simply not be there. Maybe a bit of a sidestep, Sam, but if you look at, for instance, with India also be under very, very tight lockdown, and a large I would say a large segment of their population being adrift, which is a terrible situation, of course. But how does that work if you are dependent on business process automation or business process outsourcing into those areas? Does that give any relief?
Well, we know from the sort of the reality of what happens is, yes, basically those operations are limping along. They are just about surviving. However, the infrastructure for actually moving those operations at centralized locations and being in, and I think that's one of the things that is just sort of highlighted, that we've heard horror stories of complete shared service buildings being locked down. This is even before we have full lockdowns, because there's been a case and you just lose a building in one go. And actually, as part of this process of actually outsourcing and centralizing, etc., we've kind of almost been forced sort of in 2 or 3 weeks to go to a completely decentralized model. And it's kind of completely flipped that on its head. And I think, yes, those elements are just surviving, but I think a lot of companies, they're in a position where actually what they're doing from that outsourcing perspective, it's just not sustainable. And everyone's doing as good as they can, but I think quite often people either are going to have to start looking at other options now, or in the very near future.
let's talk about options, Sam, because obviously, I think many people know what's going on. Many people understand how bad it is. I believe many
Yeah.
organizations feel the
Yep.
pain. But of course, at the end of the day, what the lifeblood of any company is cash, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you start looking at the effects on supply chains and specifically, the ability to fulfill in these supply chains, where sometimes consumer demand has pretty much stopped, but there's other areas of markets where things are still quite, I wouldn't say booming, but quite lively.
Yeah.
At the same time, I mean, lack of cash does any business in. What do you feel if you look at this? So you look at this from an accounts payable, accounts receivable perspective. What are the effects of this on supply chain? And if you start thinking into options, into potential, I wouldn't call it a quick fix, but we are in crisis mode.
Yeah.
What are the options that we could resort to in order to at least see a light at the end of the tunnel here?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the first thing that you've got to sort of, with supply chains, you've got to realize is the impact of this has, and this is why we're talking about AR and AP together, it's just been, the effect is as bad for both sides. So actually, I think it's almost something that's brought maybe some of those sort of departments together between suppliers and buyers. Everyone is in the same boat. And what I was talking about is, we had that lowest common denominator that was paper, and actually the most sort of practical solution that we are seeing that people are using as that sort of quick thing to implement is people are going back to using portals. And yes, portals we may have been using for specific types of spend or specific types of suppliers, but the fact is that a portal is something that can be accessed on any internet enabled device. It allows someone to do some work either as a supplier or as a buyer to enter in data, enter in invoice data, and that is very much almost providing that sticky plaster that can actually mean that people can get those documents moving backwards and forwards for cash. And I think one of the other things as well is, we're talking about AP and AR. This is an impact across the whole piece. So, our processes are also built on things, people receiving purchase orders. You may be at the stage now that you can't get a purchase order to a supplier. So actually just having something in the middle that's kind of just there that you can access easily and someone can see that data. Yes, we may be doing more manual processes either side. However, it is something that, doesn't require a lot of work to get up and running, and actually that's what we're seeing mainly as the thing that's replacing paper out there with customers.
So basically what you're saying, Sam, is that it is quite manual, but
yeah,
a portal is a way of at least making sure you get the invoice data to the customer so that they can pay you.
Yes.
And using a portal, then obviously, the fact that you can get that invoice to your customer also means that you have supply chain financing options or dynamic discounting options to put cash into the supply chain quicker, don't you?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I actually think that if we look at some of the responses of businesses, a lot of businesses are kind of looking at these financing options, and for me, that's actually quite a good sign that business maturity is at quite a good level. I think, in effect, so if we look at retail, for example, we've had some amazing examples, like in the UK with Morrison's paying people straight away. I think because it's been such a big shock, a lot of people have had to make a lot of decisions quickly that really can help suppliers because they understand, like we were saying at the start, this is a brutal situation. Let's not mess around. This will wipe out a lot of businesses. And by the fact that people are recognizing the importance of their supply chain, yes, they are offering these options and they're great, but we also need to make sure that there is physically a way of getting that invoice across, but actually remember that, we need to pay, we say we're going to pay suppliers straight on time. You can't really have then a 20-30 day process actually causing that bottleneck anyway. You're losing that that great gesture that you're going to do for your supply chain. You're losing that if you don't have the ability to actually run that process through quickly. And that's where actually we think that using a portal in this kind of environment, which probably goes against of what I've been saying lots of times before, it is actually, I think, something that will get a lot of benefit from both sides of the parties, and it just helps keep that cash flowing.
Yes, Sam, you're right. It does go against what you have said before on multiple occasions, but I get where you're coming from. It's basically the only way that you can be. You have a remote system that is decentralized enough to give people access to information from wherever they are.
And I think it's about adjusting your reality to what the new sort of lowest common denominator is. I mean, I think that's, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what we think in the future, but, you know, I think, you know, we've almost had that comfort blanket of paper from AP removed. And now we need to think about what we can do with that comfort blanket removed and how we can move forward.
Yeah, you're making a good point there. Let's talk about government for a second, because of course, we all want to, we all want to survive this, and at the same time, governments are, well, at least quite a number of governments are stepping in quite heavily with, as I said earlier, massive support programs. I mean, I know, I'm from Holland. The Dutch government is stepping up to support the economy with more than 90 billion euros, which is, for a country the size of the Netherlands, is a staggering amount of money. If you look at the numbers in the UK, numbers in the US are enormous. These support programs are obviously very necessary. The governments are trying to avoid mass unemployment. What that would probably do if that happened is that you push all sorts of problems further down the line, but they will actually come back to you. So I wholeheartedly support the whole idea of government stepping in. But at the same time, there's something that we need to realize here, that only a few months ago, or actually only a few weeks ago, we've been running several webinars here in Tungsten Network about upcoming government mandates with regards to mandatory electronic invoicing, or what we would call continuous tax controls, where businesses need to report invoice flows proactively to governments, so that governments have a much better handle on tax collection. If you remember, some of you may have joined these webinars. If you remember, we spoke about the success in Italy, where Italy has been capable of reducing their tax gap with roughly 11% through 2019, which is a very, very big number. That's 4 billion euros. And just about 2 weeks later, we're seeing the need for governments to step in with billions of euros or dollars or pounds or whatever other currency, also plus to come together in Europe to support each other with very, very large amounts of money. And what we see in the wake of that is that quite a number of these mandates, of course, Italy already has one. Italy has mandatory electronic invoicing, but some other countries have postponed their initiatives, or are currently looking very critically at the feasibility of introducing taxation programs into their economies, because obviously, as Sam was saying earlier, suppliers have or businesses have very big fish to fry. And the last thing they want to do, obviously, is also get caught in a lot of red tape and having to change systems, which probably they're not even going to be able to do.
No.
And at the same time, the costs for healthcare are probably going to go through the roof in pretty much any country. So we are seeing at the same time also gestures from governments where they delay tax collection and tax filing. Probably also, again, because there's nobody there really to do it. And fully digitized governments are probably going to press on. So one thing that we do see here is that this immediately shows a case for governments to after this is all over, to start looking at what I would call pervasive filing and pervasive tax collection technologies, in order to ensure that they can build these buffers back up. because we do need to realize that even though the governments are stepping in at the moment to specifically protect the small medium enterprises who are extremely vulnerable under this situation, is that the money will have to come back at some point.
Yeah, it's not.
It's not free. So
No.
what do you think is going to happen there, Sam? We see these massive gestures, which are absolutely necessary. At the same time, we know that many governments were actually building plans or actually were at the brink of implementation of tax collection programs, which they now have to delay. What do you think? What do you think governments are going to react moving forward?
So, I mean, I think, like you've said, we've probably had this sort of pause and a breath and a delay. And obviously, a lot of these government strategies are going to be, we need to pump money in to get everything ready for the bounce back afterwards. It's like you were saying about the unemployment, it's all very important for the economy to be in a position that can bounce back. But if we're kind of thinking about it, like you said, there will be government at some point will need to claw this money back. There's not going to be free money, and that's understandable. And I think we're probably going to have seen a pause and a breath, and then I think we're probably going to see, when we've been looking at these mandates, I think they are going to be, fundamentally brought in. And also, if we just think that with a lot of the measures as well, we've now got, it's almost forced the hand to be government to be more involved in business. We've got governments paying people's salaries for a certain amounts of periods, etc., etc. Government has got, because of this, has got more invested in actually that process. So I think, these mandates that we've been seeing with the likes of Italy and that, I think it's kind of inevitable that's going to come in. And I think also flipping it around, this, everything that's gone on is, like I was saying, paper's gone. So actually, in some ways, it's forced people to digitize. So actually, in terms of through a complete shock that nobody wanted to happen, actually companies are probably going to come out of this more digital than they were at the start, which actually then does mean that if governments actually, digitize tax, put e-invoice mandates in, etc., etc., they're going to be able to put that in quickly, and they're going to be able to put that in quicker.
That raises my question then to you here, is that how our government, we've spoken about how governments are going to react, but where is this going to go into the near future? Do you believe actually that we're going to go back to where we came from, for instance?
So this is quite a, I just can't see it. I just cannot see. We talked about the risk registry, etc., etc. I cannot see businesses being able to, and even fundamentally, in our lives, we're all sitting here probably at home in various states of dress. Me and Rude have got our nice shirts on. Even from a personal perspective, can you just imagine going back and doing a commute every day into an office? This has forced a decentralization of workforces and offices and decentralization of processes. And like I was saying, it's forced some digitalization in as well as a mean of surviving. So the very concept of us, I talk to people a lot of time, and we might talk about how we handle paper invoices, because they're always out, aren't they? I'm really struggling to see how I'm going to have that conversation in the future. So yeah, I think it is to be a fundamental change.
So what do you think that does to order to cash and procure to pay processes? Because if we're not going back to the old days, and we're not going back to potentially paper, we're not going back to the level of centralization we've seen before, because we understand it's very vulnerable. Then you are going to have to rethink your order to cash and procure to pay process. Would that mean that you look at a very specific way of digitizing that?
Yeah, I think we're going to see more digitized processes. I think we're probably going to see suppliers and buyers closer together, because actually, if you think of it as an experience, it's forced companies to work together more, because like we said, we've seen with the payment terms, etc., etc., companies are realizing that, we need to go work through this together. I think naturally some of those barriers will have been broken down, and businesses will work on these things a lot more sort of end to end and harmonized. And I think it will have forced that in. And I think inevitably, I think we're going to have governments involved in this somehow. So I think not only is that digitization going to be between, you know, your traditional buying something, someone supplying something, I think, you know, the whole element of tax, like you said, being digitized, and that, I think that's going to be a fundamental element of anything we've got moving forward.
Sam, I agree. I fundamentally agree with this. Of course, it's very difficult to say for sure because no one here has a crystal ball. We don't know how long this is going to last. Unfortunately, well, that's my personal opinion. I believe this is going to last quite a bit longer than anybody really cares for.
Yes.
But as such, we need to prepare ourselves for, you know, a fairly extended period where people are going to be under lockdown until this thing dwindles down and we can return back to more or less a normal life. And as I said before, so, and you are right about that, so the governments are stepping in at the moment to ensure that we don't sort of like end up in a global crisis of a magnitude we haven't seen before, with mass unemployment, which is going to cause all sorts of issues down the road. But at some point, governments already had substantial tax gaps, and they were looking to close those. Those tax gaps will only have become quite a bit bigger from here on. So my advice to everybody on the call would be, and actually anybody involved in, you know, trade, business, sending each other invoices, but, you know, and also taxable supply. Yeah, prepare yourself for a future where governments are going to be quite heavily involved, where there's going to be quite a bit of reporting duties and potentially mandatory electronic ways, because I don't think that governments can, let's put it this way, governments can do this once. Governments can step in with these amounts of money once, but frankly, there's not going to be a second time. There simply will not be the funds around to do it. At the same time, Sam, if I summarize what you said before, is that, you know, paper is a vulnerable medium. We now realize that we've built processes around paper invoices that rely on everything working quite swimmingly, that rely on effectiveness of, you know, people centrally creating invoices, stuffing and franking these, and then rely on postal services to get these to the other side, where we yet again have to rely on people to process these invoices and actually sometimes even box them up and ship them to a lower cost location. We're now seeing that this is so heavily disrupted that that process can't work. And if I heard you correctly, what you recommended as a relatively quick fix is to start looking at portals, so that at least suppliers can provide their customers with the most basic information those customers need in order to pay their invoices. And of course, you know, we'll look at compliance later. That's perhaps a bit strange from my mouth, being the head of compliance. But you know,
we've got this recorded, Ruud.
Very much, but we need to be very pragmatic here. So the first and foremost thing to do is to ensure that, you know, you can bring the cash back to the supplier for the services and products rendered, and then we can look at how we deal with this compliantly later. That brings me to more or less the end of the webinar, Sam. But you always have some wise words at the end, so can I ask you to give those to us at this moment of time, and then we can open questions.
No, I mean, I think one of the key things as well that, you know, over the last few weeks been horrendously busy, and we've been talking to so many people about what we think we can do. But I think, you know, one of the really sort of positive things about this is the more we talk to each other as businesses. So we talked about, you know, I think that this will bring suppliers and buyers closer together because everyone's in this together. But also, you know, if we're helping a supermarket get food, you know, support their suppliers to get food, you know, the businesses that are, you know, government has decided can survive, they're fundamentally there to support the country, the global economy. We're supporting people. So I think it's one of these things that if anyone does have any good ideas or any best practice or have come up with a magical way, I think it's really there for everyone to share. And I think if you look at things like LinkedIn, etc., there's been a real upsurge of blogs. I mean, the fact we're having this discussion now, I think it's important that You know, we say tungsten, we're a network. You know, it's about also not just a physical network, it's about sharing those ideas and that best practice across the piece that we can really help get through this and actually, you know, realize how it's fundamentally going to change our lives afterwards as well. So I think that would be my closing thought.
Thank you very much, Sam. As usual, quite wise. I'd like to open up for some questions. If you have any questions, you can type them into the question box, and we'll give you some time to do that. I see a question coming in. Thank you very much for that. A question that we see coming in is, it's rather long, so I'll summarize it. Obviously, China has been hit quite hard. It's currently bouncing back. Do we see any developments with regards to electronic invoicing in China, or the use of portals, as you summarized it, Sam? I think these things are currently rather synonymous. Do we see any developments there? I can start, Sam, and then pass over to you. What we are seeing in China, we actually saw that before the crisis and before China got hit so hard, is that the government was already looking at ways to modernize their taxation system. It was fairly complex with, special VAT and simple VAT invoices, where some could be made electronic, others couldn't. There is quite heavy government intervention in China already, where invoices need to be printed, special VAT invoices need to be printed on government printers in order to be tax deductible. So in that sense, in a way, very paper-based with the paper fat piao. And then the other question is, the other bit being that they are quite advanced with their government intervention. We've seen programs being started up recently in China that will actually move to digitization a lot more than they have done before, but also a dramatic tax simplification. What that's going to look like, we don't know, but we do know that China's moving, and of course we're taking a very healthy interest in what is going on over there. And we'll keep you posted on that. We also have a question here from Joy. Sam, I'm not sure if you can read this.
I'll have a go.
You'll have a go, because it's also a rather long question. If you can summarize the question and then see if we could answer that question, please.
Often. Oh, okay, that's a really good question. So I think it's probably framing up, after the impact, what lessons should we learn, and what we should think about the supply chain impacts across afterwards. And I think it is going to be, I think it's going to be more of an understanding of how businesses work and how they're connected and joined together. And I think really it will be that the focus has to be digital, because we just can't rely. I can't see anyone ever practically really being able to say, okay, as part of our BCP, we're going to go back to a paper process now, because I don't think suppliers will want to do it. I don't think buyers will want to do it. I think that's going to change that I just can't see us being able to do that anymore. And I think it will be more of an understanding of how businesses work together. I think that will probably be quite a large impact afterwards.
It raises an interesting question, Sam. Here, it's a really good question. Thank you very much for that. Do you believe that scrutiny from companies towards each other with regards to what their BCPs look like in situations like these, do you believe that's going to change dramatically?
Yeah, actually, that is a good point. I probably will. And we've been sort of saying about, we've got companies before this crisis probably had more information about their suppliers than they ever had before, but nobody ever thought something like this was probably going to happen in any kind of planning or scenario. Like we said, the scenario if your Wi-Fi goes down, or we had the volcano, didn't we, a few years ago, that blocked air travel for a little bit, and everyone had to get hire cars to pootle around Europe. And I think I think not only will it force companies to work together a lot closer, but it'll also need to be that actually if something ever like this did happen, there's a way that people can continue and carry on working. And we have to remember, without horribly sounding too doom or gloom, even if we're over and out of lockdown, I think, is it going to happen again? We do that with any form of BCP planning. You've got to think, is something going to happen again? But I also think it's human nature as well. And we are in a once in a lifetime, hopefully, type event that will stick in people's memory for a long time.
I would totally agree with you. Back to that question you were just answering, it's actually a very, very, very good question. Thinking about where this might end up, and this is just thinking out of the box and do this while I'm sitting in my home office, is that to have a BCP, a business resumption plan, or a disaster recovery plan as a company probably is not going to be enough anymore.
No.
What you are going to have to look at is almost like business continuity plans across supply chains.
Yep.
To ensure that you'll probably start looking at integration of BCPs across the supply chain. That sounds extremely utopic, but I can see that happen, because it doesn't really matter, as Sam said before. It doesn't matter whether you have a business disruption plan that actually might help here, but if your supply chain doesn't, it doesn't actually matter that much. So, we can possibly see it going that way, and that then also will incorporate the financial supply chain as well.
Yeah,
it's not just about movement of goods, but it's also about the transfer
cash
of money and making sure that people can people can continue to do what they were doing. So, brilliant question. It gives us a lot of food for thought. I'm going to pass back to Emma, as we have come to the end of our webinar. So Emma, over to you for closure, and I would want to thank everybody for your time.
Yeah, thank you for your time. I hope that was helpful.
I'll echo both of your thanks, Sam and Ruud. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I will be sharing a recording of this, so if you've missed any, not to worry, we'll have that to you shortly. But if you have any further questions that didn't get answered today, you can reply to that follow-up email that we will send to you, and I will be able to put you in touch with Ruud or Sam directly. But for now, just thank you again for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye.